So good morning, everyone. Today, Guillaume and I will describe folding patterns variation within and across primate species. So the first question is why studying sulky? So the first good reason is if you look at primate brain, it's striking. The sulcus organization is absolutely not random. And there is a topographic organization, and almost all sulci can be found in all individuals. And this is true in human, and this is also true in macaques. For example, if you look at in the medial surface here, in all brain you can find the central sulcus there in green. All brain display a cingulate sulcus. This is a primary sulcus occurring really early in utero, and it's there in all hemisphere, in all subject. And sometime, not sometime, in fact, it's in 70% of subject, at least in one hemisphere, there is a paracingulate sulcus here that appears. So this is a secondary sulcus. It occurs a bit later in utero. That's why it's not there in 100% of the subject. But if you look at Owenville sulci, this is a Michael Petridis map, and you can see they are all labeled, in fact. So that's why you can see all sulci can be described in all brain. And this is also true in macaque, medial wall of the macaque here. All macaques display a cingulate sulcus, and you can start having a look on some variability that I will come back later on these specific differences you can see. So the second reason to study sulci is that all my past research, but I think there is more and more research about that show that sulci are pertinent to function. Here is an example concerning the medial frontal cortex, where what we have seen with fMRI in human is that the face motor representation of the entire cingulate motor area can be seen always at the same sulcus landmark location, which is at the intersection with this vertical sulcus here that is called the posterior vertical paracingulate sulcus, and the paracingulate sulcus when it's present. But if there is no paracingulate sulcus, it's located at the intersection with this vertical sulcus and the cingulate sulcus. And it's true in all brain, in all hemisphere. At the same time, or in parallel, we have seen that this exact same region is involved in the analysis of visual and Joyce feedback. So that tells you how to adjust when you are in exploratory situation. Think about a trial and error task where you do an action, you have a feedback. If it's negative feedback, you adjust your action until you understand what is the correct action. So when you are analyzing such feedback, this in exploratory situation, the mid-cingulate cortex is highly involved. So what is really interesting is that in macaques, we observe exactly the same. We did with Emmanuel a meta-analysis of electrophysiological studies assessing the analysis of Joyce feedback, visual feedback in a similar exploratory situation. And here is the dorsal bank of the cingulate sulcus. And these areas here correspond to where we find this type of activity in the literature. And if we also did a meta-analysis of anatomical study or also electrophysiological studies, stimulation study, assessing where the face motor area of the rostral cingulate motor area is located. So imagine this line within the dorsal bank of the cingulate sulcus here, and you can see that there is a strong overlap between the face motor area and this region involved in the analysis of visual and Joyce feedback. So this means that the functional organization of this region, what we call the mid-cingulate cortex, the MCC, is well preserved from macaque to human. And the third reason to assess sulci is a recent one. It's in recent papers, we have shown that the organization of sulci may be used as a tool to understand primate brain evolution. So to do so, we analyze T1 data of a large sample of human brain from the Human Connectome project, chimpanzee brain from collaboration with William Hopkins, baboon's brain with a collaboration with Adrien Marguerite-Chian, and macaques that now there is this PRIME-DE sharing database, but at that time they were not. So it was it was difficult, but we were able to get 80 rhesus macaques for this analysis. So the first, if we look at this region that I talked about, the MCC here, the first thing that we showed is that humans display a paracingulate sulcus in about 70% of hemisphere, at least in one hemisphere, and 70% of subject, at least in one hemisphere. And it's mostly lateralized on the left. This is this yellow part here. The red part is the orange part is the lateralization on the right, and the red is in the presence in both hemispheres. But what we have shown is that chimpanzee brain display also paracingulate sulcus. And this is really important because before that, we thought that the paracingulate sulcus was human specific and linked to tons of pathology and personality traits and a lot of things like this. So obviously we saw differences. The paracingulate sulcus was present in 34% of subjects, at least in one hemisphere, so less present, and it was not lateralized. But we never observed a paracingulate sulcus in old world monkeys, baboon and macaque. So now if we look at all these vertical sulci I talked about, in human and macaque, these are really sulci, like with a strong shape like this. So we call them sulci. In baboon and macaque, we cannot really talk about sulci, but we can talk about precursor of sulci, which appears in two different forms, a spur with a shape like this, or a dimple like this. So what we did, we looked at the occurrence of these sulci in the various species. So if we start with the posterior one here, that the paracentral sulcus, we can see that it's present in all species, and it's most present in human and chimp than in baboon and macaque. And now if we look at the shape, so sulcus is in blue, green is a spur, and pink is a dimple. We can see that in human and chimp, it's always a sulcus. It's mostly a spur in baboon and mostly a dimple in macaque. So this means that, if we look at this sulcus here, that is the pre-paracentral sulcus, we can see again that there is a difference between hominids, that human and chimp on one side, and baboon and macaque on the other side, but still baboon and macaque display really often this sulcus. And again, we can see the same organization with sulci present in human and chimp. This sulcus is more a spur in baboon and more a dimple in macaque. Then the two last one, the posterior vertical paracingulate sulcus here, you can see it's mostly present in human, still there in chimp and really less in baboon and macaque. But again, we see exactly the same gradient of sulci, organization of the shape of this sulci across primates. And finally, the anterior one, here, the anterior vertical paracingulate sulcus, you can see a decrease through species of the presence of this sulcus, but still it's there in macaque. And again, the same organization, the same shift of organization between sulcus and dimple from human to macaque. And so what was really interesting is where we can find this sulci. So if we look at the paracentral sulcus, here we represent the antero-posterior level, this is the Y value, compared to a specific anatomical landmark, that is here the rostral limit of the pons. We can see here that the paracentral sulcus is located at the level of the rostral limit of the pons in all primate brains. The pre-paracentral sulcus is located in all primates at the level of the anterior commissure here. The VPCGS here, this one, is located at the caudal limit of the genu of the corpus callosum in all primate brain, and the anterior vertical paracingulate sulcus is located at the rostral part of the of the journey of the corpus callosum. So this means that these sulci are well preserved in this region in all primate brain, and they are located at anatomical landmarks that are present in all primates. If we look at now the ventromedial frontal cortex here, this region, it's characterized by 3 sulci. The superior rostral sulcus here, that is seems to be really an old sulcus present in all primate brain at the almost in 100% of hemisphere. The inferior rostral sulcus here is present. It's a secondary or tertiary sulcus. It's there only in about 30% of hemisphere in human, but in chimp it's similar. And in baboon and macaque, there is a big difference. It's almost never there. And the final one is this one here, the accessory susorbitalis sulcus. I know they are weird name, crazy name, but at least we can identify them. And again, we see a big difference between hominids and old world monkeys. But still, baboon and macaque have it. So this ventromedial frontal cortex is also well preserved. So now what's going on at the intersection between the mid-cingulate cortex and the ventromedial frontal cortex? So here is where we find the main differences. So this region is characterized this way. In human, the cingulate sulcus always end by a fork, characterized by 2 sulci, the susorbitalis and the suprarostral sulcus. This fork is located most often at the end of the paracingulate sulcus when present, and at the end of the cingulate sulcus when there is no paracingulate sulcus. And this fork is always pointing downward, like this, in human. So what's going on in the other species? So here we have in human, the fork is looking downward. This is what we see here. In 100% of hemisphere, the fork is pointing downward. In chimpanzee, we see...
Céline, you have 3 minutes left, okay?
Yeah, I'm fine. In chimpanzee, this fork is it's pointing downward in most of the case, and looking forward in like 20% of hemisphere. And in baboon and macaque, you see these 2 patterns, but also a pattern where the fork is not complete and where there is no fork. And you can see, in fact, what is important here is the pink region. When you see that from macaque to human, the fork starts to be more complete and pointing more downward. So, but you can even see in macaque the pattern that we see in human. And if we look at where is this fork is located almost at the level of the apex of the journey of the corpus callosum in human, and it's more dorsal in all other primate brain. And this is concomitant with the appearance of a new sulcus in human, that is the rostroperpendicular cingulate sulcus, probably reflecting the expansion of 9. And is also concomitant with a full setup of 2 sulci here, that are the dorsomedial polar sulcus and the ventromedial that we think delimitate area 10. So it's all this setup is of this region reflects the expansion of area 9 and the setup of area 10. So what the analysis of sulcal patterns told us, that the MCC and the ventromedial frontal cortex is well preserved, and that major changes occur at the junction between these 2 regions. And this is interesting because what we know from other studies is that sulci relate to function in both human and macaque. So we can infer we can use all this information to infer the anatomofunctional organization of this region across primates, thanks to sulci. So what next? So such sulci was done on the basis of visual inspection. But as Guillaume will explain you now, this sulcal organization can be modeled within and across primate species. And now such visual inspection can feed such models. And before to give the hand to Guillaume, I just would like to acknowledge people involved in all these studies, and especially Emmanuel Prosic and Michael Petrides. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we can immediately switch to the next speaker, Guillaume.
Yes, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
And my pointer too?
Yeah.
Yes, we
Okay.
can.
Very small yet, but you can see.
Okay, so thank you, Céline. So here, everything that I will present is a joint work with Kip Kilo and Olivier Coulon from the INT in Marseille. And so today I will explain how we can propose a model that will actually be a formalization of the observation that have been shown by Céline. So first, I want to just recall that here in my talk, I will be talking about the geometry of the brain, not the anatomy. So for this anatomical organization, I will refer to Céline. But here, let's say that we are facing a problem of defining correspondences across geometries of different brains. And here, first, I want to recall that we are facing not only one, but two dimensions of complexity. So first, as illustrated here, well, one aim is to define correspondence across brains from different species. And here you see the variations in the amount of folding across these three species. And if we have landmarks that can be found in any brain, as Céline pointed, then, okay, here in this case, we know a bit what we want to do. But in other locations, we can have such smaller folds where it's difficult to find correspondence, and that's also the case for other species. And here we have a second dimension of complexity, that is variations across individuals. And here it's important to point that across, for instance, human brains, you can have very major variations even in the topology of the folds here across humans, but actually you can have such ambiguities in any species. Okay, so we have two dimensions of complexity. We are facing that, and we need to, if we want to define correspondences across brains and species, we have to integrate both dimensions. Very briefly, there are other works that have been proposed for this task. The first one was proposed by the Van Essen's lab, where they did already use some landmarks that were defined both from a geometrical point of view, but also based on functional correspondences. There is a lot of work based on mapping techniques that were developed initially for humans, but then applied to other species. And for instance, this work is very interesting. They align myelin map across species and across brains. And different techniques here where they define some sort of connectivity profile, and they use some sort of abstract space to define the correspondence across the regions. So here, our approach is a bit different from what we have seen before, because we are explicitly building a model and we are implementing the model. So that's what I will present first, and then I will show some applications. So, well, an important point here is to define what we mean by a model. And I don't have enough time to go into all the details. I will just give you, the concept and the intuition. And for that, I will build on the talk of Céline, which I've been showing this picture several times, and you observe these landmarks. And here the idea is that we want to formalize this observation, and the observations are the following. First, I think that Céline did convince you that they are stable circular landmarks, meaning that we can find these landmarks in all brains and across species also. I go back to that point. And the second thing that we have to formalize is that these landmarks are organized. And here, just to keep the thing simple, I think we can take that as an assumption for now. So make the assumption that the circular landmarks are organized in terms of orientation and alignment. So here you see actually that we think that there are two main directions that are orthogonal with some sort of organization around circular and orthogonal. And here what we do is the aim of my job here is to generalize this observation to the rest of the brain, so including other regions here, and also to the external face. Okay, so for those of you who are interested, there are these two references if you want to know more about this one. Or I will skip that one for the sake of time, but well, there are other works supporting these assumptions. So here now let's assume that we have a model. I will go back to that, and we have the brain from one individual. And here the technical question is how can we map the brain onto the model of the reverse? We do that with the technique that has been published here. It's not hip-hop, it's fun, and it makes sense because there are two steps here. Here, conceptually, again, what we want is to map the model on the surface based on physical landmarks. So we have a set of landmarks, and we can build a model where these landmarks are organized. If we are able to do that, then we will actually have defined a set of latitude and longitude. Okay, so if we do this mapping, then we will have defined implicitly a parameterization of the brain. So here are the implementation itself. In order to flatten the brain on a rectangle, then we have first to cut the surface. So we have good reasons to do that here, first around the corpus callosum and also around the insula. That makes sense biologically because the organization at the cellular level is different between insula and the rest of the neocortex. We need another additional cut, and we do that just by searching for the shortest path between the two other regions. And well, it works, let's say, for today. We do that by minimizing given energy. Well, I'll skip that for today. Here I will show you an illustration of a single brain. So here, that's a brain that has been flattened, first step. And then what we want is to align these physical landmarks onto the model. So that's what has been done here. It's the second step that I do not describe. Here, I show you the results. So here you see the axis from the model onto which the physical landmarks have been applied. Here, there is a way to visualize the parameterization that is induced by this process by overlaying a regular grid here and looking at where this grid is localized on the original folded brain. Here is what you see. So this is some sort of latitude and longitude that you would have for the map of the Earth. And of course, we did that explicitly. The latitude and longitude are following the major fault. So here I show you how we can define a parameterization of a brain based on a model. Now, the beauty of this tool is that we can do the same for several subjects. And if we have the same model for the different brain, then we have implicitly defined correspondences across these brains. Okay, so let's see that in practice. So we have 62 human brains. Here is the first step. We flatten the brains. Then we align the folds. And then if I pick a point here, it will be between the central sulcus and the post-central sulcus for every brain. So actually, we will have defined correspondences across brains. Just to, for the sake of visualization, one convenient way to look at that is to put some colors in the rectangles here. So actually, you define a parcellation of the brain. And with such parcellation, you can visualize the mapping onto the original folding surfaces from the different brains. And you see here how the colors are corresponding. So for instance, the gray one, which is, I think, the precentral sulcus, the gyrus is well located in the same region across brains, despite large variations in the geometry across the individual. Okay, here are the two papers that describe this parcellation and a bit of validation. Okay, so that's the idea, the model and its implementation, and then I will spend the rest of the time showing some applications to other species. So that's what I did present to you. How we can do that for humans. It's quite intuitive that we can do exactly the same for macaques. Basically, we will flatten the brains and define new model, different, and we can do the same for chimpanzee and for any primate species and maybe others. Okay, let's just look briefly at the result on chimpanzee brains. Exactly the same procedure. Okay, we define landmarks that can be defined in any chimp brain, and we make some assumptions regarding the orientation. Okay, the superior frontal sulcus is orthogonal to the central sulcus. That's what is implemented here. And then we align the brain and we define a parcellation and we visualize here the correspondence across brains. Okay, I point here the fact that the number of parcels is different because the number of axes is different. Okay, but we have the same correspondences across brain that are driven by the similar assumptions regarding the pattern of the phone. Then another question is how can we use this tool to define correspondences across different species? Okay, and on principle, it's easy. We do the same. Okay, we compare we map all the brain onto the same model. But here, there is a trick. The trick is how can we define a model that makes sense for all the species? That's the crucial aspect. For that, we have two difficulties. First one is the technical one. Let's say that we have defined the model for each species, as I showed before. Then we have to define correspondence across the models, and that's very easy. We just have to translate actually the axes from one species to another. Okay, so we just apply affine transformations of the coordinates, and then we have the correspondence. So no difficulty here. The real difficulty is here in defining common Sulci, and that's obviously the job of Céline in this project. I think she did convince you that we can define some correspondences across different species. And of course, this is a work in progress. And well, the idea that the implementation and the understanding of the commonalities will go together. So let's say that we have been able to do that. Then, of course, we can take the model from one species and map it onto the brain of other species. And that's what we have done here with the model from human. And we can map that onto human brains. So the picture that I did show you before. Oh, a bit of delay. Yes. So human brains, but also, there is a delay with my laptop. Is not.
Guillaume, you have 3 minutes left.
I'm fine. So human brains here, chimp brains here, and macaques here. And so you see this 2 dimensions of complexity, variations across species and variations across individuals within each species. And you see how this mapping allows to define correspondences across brains and across species. And then, of course, we could do the same with model from other species and looking at the model from macaque onto a human brain. Of course, we can do different things with this technique. One intuitive one would be to look at expansions of areas across the different species, as what has been done by Vanessa earlier. And of course, we can do that and look at this map. So for instance, how did each region expand between chimpanzee and human? And you see the correspondence with previous literature, and also the same for between human and macaque. So I'm concluding. In conclusion, so first, the main point here is that this framework is original because it allows to test explicit assumptions regarding the organization of Sulci. So that's the originality. There is no other alternative to do that as far as we know. And also, as I pointed several times, we did efforts to integrate the dimensions of variations across individual and species. We are working on building such a model for baboon, and also we are working on how to compare and to optimize the correspondence across species by composing the mapping across the different species. So going from macaque to baboon to chimp to human is to be more efficient than going from macaque to human directly. And of course, we have a lot of work on validating both the Sulcus labeling, the mapping, the assumptions, and validation. So I stop here so that we can take a few questions. I just want to thank the colleagues from the INT, so Kepki, Olivier, colleagues that I see, Andrea, who has been helping a lot on the parcellation things, Adrien, and Bill Hopkins for the data. And here is my email if you want to have, if you have a specific question, of course, please send me an email.